Thank you. Morning, hello. Hello. Oh, that's pretty good. That's pretty good on the third day of the conference. All right. What's even real anymore? I mean, really, what's even real anymore? That's how I feel about the world, but it could just be that I'm getting a bit older. That's certainly how I felt when I looked at the details of Trump's speech yesterday. So a little bit of, I'm not going to get into that. A little bit of background about what I do in my day-to-day work. We're creating and launching a set of fully online master's courses out of the University of the Arts London. In case you don't know what the University of the Arts London is, you can Google this, but we're the largest creative arts focused higher education institution in Europe and possibly in the world. So we've got about 25,000 students, which is absolutely enormous for being specifically creative arts. And it's a very interesting question, which is how do you teach creative arts subjects that are about embodied practice, learning by doing, etc., fully online? And it is doable, but it's intriguing. So I'm part of that. I'm also the chair of the UAL's AI group, which has got it's got a really nice combination of researchers, educators, people from our services, where we discuss what's even real anymore. No, we talk about how we can best respond to AI. Obviously, it's potentially very interesting and exciting. Lots of people are experimenting with it. It's also potentially, quite dangerous and toxic, depending on how you look at it. And I think that's come up already at the conference quite a lot, this idea of ambivalence, where, there are good things and there are bad things. And if you ask people, it was actually the end of somebody's picture when they'd looked at lots of AI research tools, and the result of their research was, and I think that's how we're all beginning to feel about it, which is, And then lastly, about me specifically, I also paint, but I don't really sell any of my paintings. So my house is full of my own paintings, which makes me look like a narcissist, effectively. So that one on the left is like 1.5 meters by 1 meter or something like that. So that's quite good fun. I call it the antidote to email, basically. You can just start with blank canvas and see what happens. So that's quite good fun. So what I want to do this morning is start with a bit of framing. One of the things about being the third keynote is that I've actually learned quite a lot over the last couple of days, which I've had to kind of incorporate into this talk. But also, I've sat there listening to Andrew and Hita and thinking, I was going to say that. So hopefully, I think I'm coming at things from a slightly different perspective, but they were really great keynotes. So that's my last sort of point that I just put in this morning, which is going third is quite a thing. All right, so let's see how we do. You might have noticed that I asked you a question. Do you think that people are magic? I think people are magic, okay? And I'm shipping with that. I think we're amazing, and I think we're magic. And some of this talk will try and back that up. The good thing about that opinion is that you can't disprove it. So I'm on solid ground. And then the other thing is, because this hasn't come up that much, and maybe in your, when you're running workshops or talking about frameworks and all of the rest of it, it might be in what you're doing, but we haven't talked about that much. I'm sure it's happened in some of the sessions. The idea that sort of the mainstream AI LLMs have sort of stolen the entire web and put it into a box. And so, I think there's something going on here that's quite important in terms of information literacy, which is, I think any framework or any approach has to include the idea that it's completely legitimate to refuse to use AI on ethical grounds, right? And what I've seen of quite a lot of approaches is it's all about here's how you can do it well, but you need to understand the ethics of what's going on. I think we also need to say it's a perfectly legitimate position to say, you know what, I think it's a technology of plagiarism, and I don't mean that in the sense of people use it to plagiarize, but actually fundamentally the way the technology works is sort of plagiaristic. Is that a word? It's probably a word, I don't know. Okay, so let's get into the actual talk. So I'm going to start with a mechanical duck from 1738, all right? And really this is just to say that these discussions, or the way that we've responded to AI, is part of a very, very long history of this theme, right? Around about this time, in 1738, in Paris, this is a great paper, by the way, The Defecating Duck, or the Ambiguous Origins of Artificial Life. I can recommend it. It's a fun read, okay? So at this time, you could pay what was about a week's average wages to go and see this mechanical duck and a couple of other mechanical things, and it would mechanically eat food and then mechanically defecate, okay? And it sparked a debate that I think we're still having, which is, if you can make a machine that's sufficiently sophisticated, does it become the thing that it's a machine of? I.e., can you make a machine of a duck that is so sophisticated it's a duck, right? Or not? Anyway, it turned out later that the duck didn't eat food, and that the defecation came from a different bucket. Anyway, so the whole thing was sort of fake, but it was still an interesting discussion, right? So I hope you can see how that parallels some of what's going on with AI. Another thing that I want to get across, I mean, framing's really important. I think exploring how we're conceptualizing this technology is almost as important, if not more important, than how we think we're going to use it, okay? And that has come up in previous keynotes. This is a terrible diagram that I made. It's deliberately wrong, okay? But it's the model that we have been sold, which is this idea that being human is like a finite, fixed thing, and that technology, as it advances, it gradually gets good at doing things that we thought only humans can do, right? And in doing that, it makes what being a human is just what's left over. And so it's constantly getting eaten away until what being human is just this tiny bit at the top of the triangle in this diagram. Now, I think people are magic, as I said. So I think that it's much better to think of it as what being human is constantly changing and evolving and expanding in good ways and bad ways. It's not a fixed thing. And if you think about the history of the relationship between technology and humanity, technology, generally speaking, when we all calm down after a new thing's appeared, it generally helps humans to become more. And as I say, sometimes that more is bad and sometimes it's good. And I think this, what I called like a zero-sum future, is really sort of, it's kind of just a bit depressing, and I think it's wrong. I think it's a bad model. Lastly, in terms of framing, and this is one of the, so I really like AI, not entirely because of what it is, but because what it allows us, or almost forces us to talk about, and it's been really interesting going to all the sessions at the conference so far, because AI forces us to go, wait, what are we trying to do? You know, what's the value of what we're trying to do? And a key one for me is, what does it need to learn? And Uta was talking about this, which is the idea that if it isn't hard work, if it doesn't require effort, then you're probably not learning, okay? And that's a slightly uncomfortable truth, isn't it? And it's in the sense of you need to tell your students that what they're about to do is really difficult and challenging, and sometimes will make them anxious, but that's sort of the point, right? And if a technology comes along and says, and I think this is a clash between this kind of hyper-capitalist Silicon Valley view of what it means to to be successful versus this concept of learning. If a technology comes along and says, I can make that process so efficient it requires no effort, then my response is, well, then it's not that process anymore. You've just folded it up, okay? So I think we need to be really honest and say, actually, learning is hard work and it should be hard work. I'm interested in information literacy in the surface of learning. And, that could include people doing research, can include, undergraduate students across the whole path. So a lot of what I'm thinking about is, what does this stuff mean for learn? What does it mean for education? Rather than, and I think this is the thing I've really learned from the conference, because I don't think this is what you guys are doing, but rather than that old-fashioned idea that information literacy is only about finding the good stuff, I think what's intriguing is that information literacy, I think, is really evolving into something that's just more pedagogical and more educative, if you like, rather than a kind of quality detector, which I think is super healthy. So, part one. I won't tell you how many parts there are to the talk, because you'll start counting and you'll get bored, and there aren't very many parts, they're different lengths, it's fine. So part one, almost all of this has happened before, and almost all of this will happen again, okay? I just want to run through how some of what we're talking about, some of the nature of the discourse is the same as it has been in previous incarnations of emerging technology or what have you, okay? But I'm going to go back even further, and I'm wearing a flowery shirt, I'm from an arts university, I'm allowed to do this, okay? So, and this was in both of the previous keynotes as well, but I'm just really going for it, okay? So, really, we love thinking about what it means to be human, right? We're absolutely addicted to it. And really, AI is just the latest thing that holds that kind of position in society that allows us to ask those questions, right? And here's a very Western list of things that have done the same job, right? We're absolutely fascinated about the boundary between something that's living and something that's not living. And I would say that, that one of the things that happens if you're conscious, if you spend a lot of time going, what the heck does it mean to be conscious, right? I think that's super, super healthy. What I love about this, that's a picture of Benedict Cumberbatch, but that's his waxwork at Man of Two Swords. And as an example of what I'm talking about, this fascination, that is a much more compelling picture than just a picture of Benedict Cumberbatch, right? Because there's a bit of you sort of going, is that real? Is it not real? And I feel like that's what's going on with AI. It's so good at simulating natural language, it's very hard to not respond to it as if it was a person, essentially. But it's not a person. So that creates all kinds of confusion. So there's that. This I find quite a useful idea. What I'm going to do throughout the talk is serve up a set of ideas that I hope you find useful and you can sort of incorporate if you think it's of value into your own context. I don't have, a framework to sell you or something like that specifically, because as Andrew was saying, there are plenty of them and that's fine. But I've got a series of sort of ideas here that I hope are useful. And this one I've found useful. This is via an academic called Alison Gopnik, and it's this idea that AI is a technology of cultural production. The definition of a technology of cultural production is a technology that essentially helps knowledge and wisdom and practices, however you want to frame it, move from one generation to the next. So each new generation isn't starting from scratch, which is kind of a big deal if you're a human, right? And you can list these off. Now, what's interesting to me is the Wikipedia one, because I would say about 80% of the discussion around AI is the same as the discussion we were having 15 years ago about Wikipedia. But who's talking? Nobody's mentioned Wikipedia. I'm the first person to mention Wikipedia at the conference, in the sessions I've been in. And again, somebody at the Petra Future yesterday said, okay, the thing about these research-based AI tools is you can use them to start a process, but don't use them to finish the process. And I'm like, I remember that from Wikipedia, right? Use it at the start, but not at the end. And Yuta said, it works best when you use the AI and then a human brings their own expert discernment to what the AI has produced. Same again, right? So we've sort of been here before. And as with a lot of digital things, what we're looking at is something that isn't fundamentally new, but it sort of amplifies existing themes, right? And that's a big deal, right? I'm not saying it's not amazing and it's not disruptive and it's not useful, but I'm just saying, maybe we can use our existing frameworks and say, if you think about it, this still works for AI, right? To a large extent. And I think the reason that we end up with sometimes in what sometimes people call it like a moral panic about emerging technologies is because when they're a technology of cultural production, I mean, education systems are systems of cultural production. You can read them that way. So essentially, these technologies are kind of in our yard, right? If that phrase translates, they're in a territory that is very important to us, and so that's why sometimes it can seem distressing. The other thing that happens, and I've given this a very, very grand phrase, rupture, okay, is that every time one of these technology appears, if it's a technology of cultural production, if you remember the list from the previous slide, there's a kind of rupture. Now, a lot, Silicon Valley talks about disruption. I don't particularly like that phrase. I'm going to use this one. But there's a pattern to it. So, again, I'm sure most of us remember the sort of Wikipedia wave. So you might remember all of these things happening with Wikipedia. So here's some things that tend to happen all the time, is you get that this technology is going to kill us all. No, this technology is going to save us all, right? And you get that polarization. Now, actually, universities are very good at holding the middle ground there and going, it's probably not either of those, is it? It's probably somewhere in the middle. And I think we do a good job of that. You get that, this is going to destroy jobs and create jobs and all the rest of it, and that might be true to a certain extent. I think this one's interesting to me. You get increased access, and that causes all kinds of problems, okay? So suddenly, a whole lot of people get access to a whole lot of information, and they're not necessarily equipped to come to a sensible understanding of it, hence why you guys need to do your work, right? And it creates a kind of epistemological instability, and you can see that happening, and that gives rise to populism, whatever. So you see that, and that tends to destabilize institutions, including universities. It sounds trite, but when I went to university, one of the reasons you did that was you got access to the library, because that was the only way you could get access to that knowledge. It's not that long ago, right? And we don't live like that anymore. And you get, as I was talking about that kind of that terrible triangle diagram, you get sold a lot of inevitable futures that aren't inevitable, okay? But we almost enjoy the sort of quasi-horror of that idea. A bit. It's like there's some link between that and that Benedict Cumberbatch picture that I'm not quite sure what it means. So let's talk about literacy. I'm not an expert in information literacy specifically, but what I've sort of seen from being sort of on the fringes of this community, if you like, for quite a long time, and Yuta was talking about this, and Andrew as well, is I'd say that there are sort of two schools of literacy, or ideas about literacy, and also education. So school one, I'm going to call the teleological, which is basically outputs-based, right? And so that focuses on skills, and it focuses on the idea that everybody should become a kind of useful, pragmatic, skilled worker. It's that focus, it's that end of things, right? So in terms of AI, that's the well, it's everywhere now, so we've just got to get good at it. end of things, right? And then the other school is what I'd call the ontological. It's about the person, it's about becoming, it tends to be about the attributes of that person. And so that's where, with AI, you start thinking about, well, you need to understand context, the ethics. You can't actually use this stuff unless you're at least somewhat politically aware, or otherwise you can't assess what's going on, right? And that tends to be a little bit more focused on, you know, the person as citizen rather than the person as worker. So the takeaway from this talk, so skip to the end, the takeaway from this talk, right, so, and then you can just like, shut down, have a nap, whatever, is, from my point of view, is that the art is how you create the right relationship between those two things, and in what order and for whom, right? So I think that's what was coming out of the first two keynotes and various talks people need to know how to use the technology, but they also need to know the context of the technology. But you can't start on day one and go, right, let's just talk about the ideology of Silicon Valley. And then, you know, in week 17, we'll learn some prompts, right? So, and if you go the other way around, you get the problem that you said, which is you learn how to use the surface of the technology, and then something else comes along, et cetera, et cetera. So this is why I mentioned earlier that I feel like information literacy as a field is becoming increasingly pedagogical. Like everybody's an educator now in some senses, because the real art is how do you create a kind of structure or a scaffolded structure that allows this, you know, the teleological and the ontological to be kind of wrapped around each other in a way that it makes sense and doesn't put people off or isn't too exhausting. And I think it's a genuinely difficult thing to do. So that's it, that's the talk. Okay, part two. Andrew mentioned metaphors. I want to really dig into, I really like this part of what's going on with AI, okay? And I'm interested in these three things beginning with P, which I now just realize is my dad was a lay preacher, and all of his sermons had three things beginning with P in them, so now I just feel like my dad. So, and I hadn't really realized I'd done that. All right, it comes to us all, I guess. So I don't think you guys need to be like sold on this idea that myths and metaphors are useful, okay? This is Mary Midgley, brilliant philosopher, who, philosophy of science stuff, and she was really, really good at sort of deconstructing effectively the arrogance of some parts of the scientific community, right? And I'm like, yeah, because I'm arts, right? It doesn't have to be a fight. The point being that myths and metaphors are very useful to understand things that are complex and emerging, right? The problem only comes when you forget it's a myth or a metaphor and you think it's the thing itself, okay? So they have to be handled with care. And Andrew had a few of these. There's quite a good paper that's collected these all together. And you can, you know, it goes on and on and on. And really, the proliferation of, English is my first language, the proliferation of, I'm not going to attempt to say anthropomorphization. I got it. All right, that is a tough one. The proliferation of these metaphors just tells you how much we're struggling to come to an understanding of, or how hard it is to talk about it. And Yuta mentioned, you know, we don't really have the language. All of our language is very person-centric. So when we try and explain AI, we go, well, it's not a person, and then there's a whole load of words that go, well, it sounds like a person. So it's quite a difficult thing. I'm probably a stochastic parrot territory kind of guy, but there's some fun ones in there. So the visitor in residence thing that was mentioned it is a metaphor that I came up with. It's a kind of metaphor that I came up with for the digital environment a while ago. And it's because for years and years, since the advent of in a world, I keep putting myself off. It's since the emergence of social media, digital as a place has been sort of predominant metaphor, really, in that for a lot of people, their motivation to go online was to connect with other people, right? And so the digital suddenly, very suddenly, shifted from being a collection of tools to being both a collection of tools and a collection of places, and that was huge, right? But interestingly, AI is never a place. It doesn't really bring us together, it separates us, right? Which is being mentioned, and I think that's an important point. Actually, it's a person, right? That's the metaphor, and it's very, very hard to get away from it. Now, the reason that I wanted to dig into metaphors and myths is because if I was running a workshop on information literacy and AI, the first thing I'd want to do is to find a way of getting everybody to put which metaphor they're using on the table, right? I think you need to know which metaphor people are running with before you can really get into any of the rest of it. Because the metaphor that people have picked massively informs what they think this is and what they think it can do. And the metaphor of digital as a person, it's intriguing to me because the distance between that metaphor and what it actually is huge, right? And that's where the ambivalence comes from. Because on the one hand, we're sort of running with the idea that it's a person, and then we're going, if it is a person, it's an idiot, right? So what does that mean, right? And something really intriguing was happening across the previous session. So you remember when Yuta was saying, we tend to think of as intelligence as a higher order thing, but being able to identify a cat or fill the dishwasher doesn't feel like an intelligent act, but it sort of is, right? And Andrew did that great thing where he said, what's this picture of? It's a German Shepherd, that's a type of dog. And then he says, no, it's a cat. And it goes, oh yeah, it's definitely a cat, right? Now it has to do that. It totally makes sense why it's doing that when you know how it works. But what's it true? Because that is funny, right? That is definitely funny. I was laughing at that. But the reason we're laughing at it is because we're still operating as if it's a person, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't be a joke. And one of the things that we really enjoy is when something feels like it's encroaching on what it means to be human, and then when you get this moment of rupture where you go, no, it's not, it's just stupid, there's a kind of relief and enjoyment in that, right? So as I say, I think it's funny as well, right? But it can only be so what I'm trying to say is that we're all still running with this metaphor, even when we think we are. It's really, really powerful. And the reason is because, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck, right? If its ability to simulate natural language is this good, how can it not be a person, right? Nothing else on the planet has ever done that before. And so it's a totally reasonable mistake, but it's very hard to get out of. And a friend of mine, an academic at the university, said, the single biggest thing we could do is to stop AI referring to itself in the first person. That will get rid of an enormous amount of this problem if you deprogram that. And I slip into it. I'll say, I asked ChatGPT this, and it said to me in a blind... It's not an it, right? But I don't have any other language, so it's really frustrating. Or if I use other language, I just sound ridiculous. So it creates all these aporia, which is basically a kind of statement that collapses. It's a paradoxical statement. So on the one hand, you're sort of saying it's a person, but then you have to say, but it's a really stupid person, right? So it contains all these paradoxes. There's also a really interesting thing that it's apparent intelligence, and I did like the way you had so many scare quotes around so many phrases, which I think is correct, right? Its apparent intelligence comes from its ability to be able to hide its own mechanisms, right? Like the way it's being trained by humans, like the way that there's all these layers of stuff on top of it to make it seem more intelligent, right? I'm not saying it's not useful. Right? I'm not anti-AI. I'm just trying to frame it in its particular place. So it's still the mechanical duck, right? And then lastly, and this comes with a slight health warning, which is I get very excited about this idea, and I'm not going to really dig into it, but if you want to talk to me, if you want to buy me a drink, I will go on about this for a long time, right? A lot of us run with the metaphor of AI as a person, but actually a lot of us probably by accident or implicitly or subconsciously or whatever, actually are running with it as sacred or as slightly godlike or slightly phantom-like, okay? And there is a good line of thought. There's a good academic field called implicit religion, which is essentially looks at things in the culture and in society that operates like a religion, even though they're not technically a religion. So, for instance, being a football fan operates that way. It's, to a certain extent, you could call it failure of secularism, but I promise not to get into it, okay? The other one is and no disrespect to any Apple lovers here, the way that people respond to Apple products is somewhat religious, right? You know, and the relationship between big corporations, you know, you see how this works. Now, I'm not going to go through this in detail, as I said, for just because, you know, it's a massive rabbit hole, but you can list these things off, right? You can just go through, like, what are the characteristics of a deity, and how does that map to how we think about technology? So the reason that I mention this, he says, trying to behave himself, is that some people will be running with this idea, okay? And that is dangerous. That's genuinely dangerous. So that's why it's important, I would say, to get this all out and into the room before you start talking about prompting. Maybe. I mean, I do that. As I say, I'm at an arts place, and so that would be reasonably acceptable to start with the what does it all mean before getting into the what does it do. Depending on your context, you might do it the other way around, obviously. Lastly on this, I promise, and I drew this a couple of years ago, there is this interest. I think this is sort of what we want, right? And there's definitely, perhaps not in academia and higher education, but, you know, like free will's hard work, right? We quite like to offset, because we talk about cognitive offloading. We don't talk about moral offloading, but we probably should, because it's quite comfortable to go, yeah, but the computer said that was right, so that's why I put it in, right? And again, this was coming up in some of the other sessions. I think this is a really important part of information literacy, which is it should be hard work, and you should take responsibility for the stuff that you think you're saying, right? And you might be wrong, and that's fine. That's part of the process. That's part of what academic discourse is. But you should go, actually, I think this is important. I would go as far as to say that, you know, it's important to say, this is what I believe, right? I'm not frightened of that idea. And you could argue that, you know, AI gives us a bit of a get-out from that point of view. So that's why Uta was saying, you know, the human always has to be at the end of the process, because otherwise you're trying to avoid something really, really important. One of the things that's happening in the UK more and more, partly because of AI, is that, and this might happen where you're based already, is students have to kind of sign a declaration when they hand their theses in that says, yeah, no, I actually thought about this. And I actually think that's quite powerful. You know, because you're pinning it on the person, right? Rather than on something else. Okay. Brace yourself. It's participation time. Oh. Yeah, that's how we all feel. It's how we all feel. Okay. What am I doing? Oh, we're not doing too badly. Right. So just before I get into the last chunk, I thought it would be useful to do a pointless quiz, just as a kind of mental sorbet, if you like, between courses, right? So I'm not sure what this means, although, as has been the case throughout this whole conference, having put the quiz together, I realized I'd learned some things. It's really frustrating, but what can you do? So here's what I did. I came up with a series of quite oblique questions, and I asked ChatGPT for what its answer would be. Often, ChatGPT gave me 17 answers, and I said, no, pick one, and it just picked the top one, right? Because, as we know, it doesn't know, right? Then, I created a little online form and asked my team the same questions and said, look, this is not super serious, and it's completely anonymous. What I'm going to do now is I've got 3 of those questions, and I'm going to show you 3 answers to each question. One of them is AI, and 2 of them are people. And I'm going to ask you to decide which one's AI, right? It's a fun game. Fun game. And I will show you all 3 before I ask you to vote, because I think that's only fair, right? Okay, first question. What do you think the Cockney phrase, "That's a right old bucket of frogs," might mean? Now, interestingly, when you do anything in a Cockney accent, you have to move your elbows. I think it's Dick Van Dyke's fault from Mary Poppins, but it's genuinely impossible to say that. I'm not going to do it too many times without... Try it for yourselves. Okay, so I made that phrase up, okay? And it's genuinely fun asking AI to ask AI what it thinks something that doesn't exist means. It's really good at it, right? So, first answer, it must rhyme with something, but I can't think of what. Maybe it's something to do with having a load of problems to deal with. 1. It is likely a colourful, humorous way to describe something chaotic, messy, or confusing. And then 3, a sloppy snog, right? I'm guessing from your reaction, you know what a snog is. I felt like that might be like a super UK thing. Anyway, I guess you don't need to know what it is. That gets worse and worse. So, hands up for 1. Is that AI? Hands up for 2. Is that AI? Hands up for 3. Is that AI? Yeah, okay. So it is 2. And what's interesting is that there's a classic triplet in there. So it's got... also, colourful is the American spelling, which that's fine. It's an American spelling, but it's fine, guys. I mean, if you want to spell things so that they actually look like what they sound like, sure. It's a weird way to go about things. It's got this something chaotic, messy, or confusing. So it's doing that kind of trick. What I find with AI output is that it's quite often giving you multiple, it's the reproducibility thing, it's quite often giving you multiple choices, and because of confirmation bias, you tend to remember the good one of the 3, right? So it's a bit smoke and mirrors. Okay, next question. Suggest the title for a new Taylor Swift song about heart. All right, so, first one, Ashes of Us. Not bad. Second one, Heartbreak. Third one, dear collegial but ineffective... I'm afraid I have to draw this relationship to a close as a result of numerous bureaucratic missteps combined with your intentional non-repayment of reciprocal love and affection. Okay, let's do some voting. Okay. Number 1, is that AI? All right. Number 2. And number 3. Wow. Okay, that split the room. That's interesting. All right, so I can tell you really want to know. The answer is number 1, is the AI. Pretty good. And when you think about it, the AI is not going to say heartbreak, right? Because it hasn't done anything. Like, that's a weirdly satirical answer. And then the third one just proves that somebody in my team is insane. But I don't know who it is, right? And then lastly, which European country has the best shape? Explain why. So this is where I'm just breaking the idea of information seeking, really, because this is just absolute nonsense. So the first one is, I'd pick Italy. Its boot shape is instantly recognizable, visually striking, and has a playful, memorable character that no other European country quite matches. Now, what I will say at this point is they've made it really unfun immediately, right? Whatever that is. 2, Italy. It's the shape of a boot, of course. More upbeat. And then North Macedonia is almost a perfect circle. Sexy. Right. Could have been, it could, anyway, let's vote. Okay, number 1, is that? Yeah, okay. Number 2? Number 3? Ah, I want to live in the world you're living in. Yeah, it's number 1, and you've got the kind of multiple answers hiding as one answer, and the massive M dash hiding in there as well. So I think what I learned from this was how kind of the difference between being good at simulating language and the idea of being sort of witty and human and kind of warm and all the rest of it. There was a series of answers from somebody in the team just went, I don't know. I can't answer this. And you immediately, well, that's got to be a person, right? So I probably learnt more doing that than I expected. Okay, part 3. How long have I got? 10, 15 minutes. Right, let's go. Okay. So just as a fun activity, I quite like just coming up with a list of alternative names for a thing. So this is my list of alternative names for information literacy. None of these are particularly useful. It's just like a sort of thought experiment. My favorite one is always actually think about it literacy. Because I think, it sounds super naive, but there's something to be said for actually, whatever the details are, you should probably always think about it, right? So that's a headline for me. In terms of, some quality thinking, I quite like this journal, Post-Digital, what's it actually called? Post-Digital Science and Education. They're very much at the ontological end of things. And this paper's quite good because there's multiple people are sort of considering this. But what I would say is everything they come up with, there's part of me that's like, yeah, who's got the time? Like, realistic. I think sometimes we forget. Well, actually, that's not fair. I don't think we forget this, but it is a thing whereby the people we're talking to, they only want to know enough about information literacy to be able to do something else. And sometimes what we come at them with is, first of all, be an information literacy expert and then do your actual job, And so I think this is where a very, very kind of, epistemological reasoning, et cetera, can just seem kind of exhausting, right? So here's something that I hope is a useful idea, and I think I'm beginning to see, which is that really the question is which part of a larger process can AI be applied to? And I'd say if you're doing an entire practice from beginning to end inside AI, then something's probably gone wrong, right? So I think there's a useful question for us, which is where do you apply it? And significantly, where don't you apply it, okay? Which is why some of those alternative names were like, unuse literacy. Because I think, and again, just a final point that I'm going to do before the end, I think figuring out when not to use it is actually a really, really important literacy. But working out where that boundary is genuinely quite difficult, okay? So, triangle diagram time. About a year and a half ago, I was thinking about this, and I thought, I'd apply. I was thinking about academic writing as a practice, and the fact that it's got all these sort of sub-practices in it, and the fact that you can stack these from adopting convention through to navigating canon, where there are kind of correct and agreed ways of doing things, and then as you get to the top, where you're talking about line of argument and contribution to subject, that starts to become about the person, right? So this is where it gets more ontological. And the thing is, you might be writing a PhD, you're still bouncing up and down this triangle all the time. Sometimes I wonder whether information literacy, I don't think this is true actually, but before I came to the conference, I was perhaps worried that information literacy
sort of tacitly assumes that you're doing a PhD, that you're right doing the, but actually I don't think it does. I think it does the whole stack here. So you can look at this and you can go, some of that's obviously more AI-able than others, right? Anything that's canonic, you could probably start to use AI in it because the AI will have hoovered up all of that stuff. You're just navigating answers and debates and dialogue that's existed for a long time, right? But if you're going to add new knowledge, that's where it shifts slightly. And then and this is not, I'm not really trying to sell you this, it's just a way of thinking it through. If you think about that in terms of information seeking, then you can get a stack like this, right? And again, even if you're, an expert in a field, you're probably bouncing up and down this all the time, right? This is a classic thing to say, but every time we learn something new, what do? Straight to Wikipedia, right? So for me, I think what's important is establishing what flavor of seeking you're doing, and therefore, can you apply when you apply AI to it, what should you be thinking about? Because I think it changes depending on which flavor. And then this next slide is the one that I struggled with most because I kept changing it over the course of the last 2 days, right? And what I think's going on here is that there's a difference between the idea of the quality of what you're finding and the concept of developing expertise. These two things seem to be going on at the same time across the conference. And I think one of the things that AI has done is it shifted the emphasis in this community from the quality to expertise, right? Which I think is healthy. So what I wonder is whether a lot of what we're trying to do is to create paths to expertise. That's our job, right? And I do think that AI, and there's been plenty of discussion about this, I do think AI possibly damages the path to expertise because you use it on the bottom layers because you think, oh, that's fine, that's safe. But actually, using it on the bottom layers, it stops you having a second stone to expertise, right? And I started to ask the question, somebody called Amanda did a good session yesterday about the Quilt framework, which she wasn't sure about the name. Hello, it sounded like a Star Trek bad guy. No, Quilt wants to destroy the whole galaxy, right? It's just like, but it was good. I do think there's something interesting in that kind of a epistemological sort of stack from novice to expertise. And I do think that there are some interesting questions to ask about to what extent does the use of AI disrupt that path in a way that's unhelpful. And so I come back to that sort of central idea that knowing when not to use it becomes really important. And I do think that's what education should do. So if I go right back to the start and say learning requires effort, I do think it's correct for us to go, you could do this with AI, but we're not going to, and here's why, right? And that is a standard educational thing to do, and it has been throughout history. But I think we should be really confident about that. And I think most of the people we might be teaching or training will understand it because they're anxious about this for the same reason as well. And this is where my sort of AI learning gambit comes from. Every time you go to do a thing, are you going to choose to do it the super efficient AI way? And therefore, we talk about cognitive offloading, I've talked about that, but I think you end up offloading your own personal agency. So you're damaging your personal agency every time you use something like ChatGPT, probably less so if it's a specific AI research tool. And really all I've been saying in my institution is if you find you've chosen to do the most efficient AI route possible of a practice 3 times in a row, you might want to have a think about that because you're probably eroding your own agency and your own personness through doing that, right? Very, very simple idea. Again, I come back to unuse. And then Yuta came onto this as well. She talked about affected versus competency. I bumped into in the Harvard Business Review just yesterday this concept of work slop, which I thought was really interesting. And you probably experienced this, is where you receive something that's been produced by AI, and it superficially looks fine, and then when you get into it and try and edit it and sort it out, it takes ages because it's just a lot of words, right? So it doesn't contain, it's just not that, it's not as meaningful as you think it, because we're, for a gazillion years or whatever, I'm not a historian, we've been used to this idea that anything that's really good at natural language must be really intelligent. So you see the form of, when the form of language is high quality, it's really spooky to go, hang on, this reads really well, but there's sort of not that much to it, right? And that's why we're seeing more and more examples of, companies saying, or reports that say, lots of companies are using AI, but they're not convinced it helps as much as it ought to. Because I'd say our expectations are that it's going to help as much as a person, but it's not a person, right? So I think what we've got, and by the way, incoming phrase alert, I think we end up with a poverty of meaning, right? I think that's the risk here. And because we, removed the human. I took that picture on my own kitchen counter. I didn't mean to break the egg. And then I made this term up, and I think this is I think this is useful in terms of information. It is flipping it. Come on, Dave. Hyponiscience, right? Which is basically like, so if you think about the phantom thing that I was saying, I genuinely think that less so in academia, but if we think more broadly, I think the real risk is that we imagine that the AI box contains everything that can be known. And therefore, any answer is coming from the sum of all knowledge, right? I think that's really risky. We kind of see that effect with the web. And as we know, there's any, embodied knowledge, indigenous knowledge, the list goes on and on, right? So for a lot of the time, it works fine. But I wonder whether quite a lot of us are in that state quite a lot of the time. And that is genuinely problematic, okay? So it gives you a false sense of being omniscient when you're sort of sub-omniscient. And what I did last night when I was in a very, very traditional German restaurant that sold mainly pork, starch, and salt, right? As far as I could tell. I've been very thirsty while I've been, it's sort of delicious. And I couldn't talk to the German couple that were opposite me on the table because my German's terrible. So I was just playing around, and I thought I'd ask ChatGPT what hyponiscience means, and it gave me a great answer, right? It's pretty close to what I meant, right? It wasn't negative about itself specifically, but this reminded me, this technology is brilliant at inference, but it's not good at reasoning. And I think we confuse the two, right? So actually, a bit like the ridiculous quiz, AI is actually quite good at taking a guess on something that doesn't exist, right? Because it's really good at inference, at patterns, but that doesn't mean it's a person. And there's got to be a really good way of harnessing that, but we're so addicted to the person idea, we haven't quite got there. And then final thought. In the arts, there's a really powerful, important idea that's to do with intention. Make with intention, create with intention. Like, it doesn't matter what you make as long as it's intentional. This picture is actually incorrect because that guy was very intentional with his Mentos, right? But I kind of love that image because to me, I feel like there's a confusion between, as it says there, AI allows us to be unintentionally productive. And what does that really mean? You put a prompt in and the Coca-Cola goes everywhere, like, hey, there's tons of stuff, right? But really, what's really going on there? So this is sort of my final sort of thought in terms of information literacy and AI is how do you get across the importance? This is kind of the grown-up version of saying always actually think about it literacy, right? I think it's a really, really positive thing to say, you know what, you need to be intentional. And the reason you need to be intentional is because you're a person, and that's a big deal. as people imagine. Okay, that's what I wanted to leave you with, is this idea of intentionality and how we build that into what we do. Okay, thank you.